that. So I think this makes sense now to move on to the next topic. Actually, it's somewhat related. It's an economic topic, and boards and how you anti-discrimination in selecting your board is a economic and political issue, and that's the idea of this Amazon $15 minimum wage. So Amazon, very large company, has decided to pay all their workers a $15 minimum wage voluntarily. Now, I believe in private property. I'm an individualist. I think if Amazon, as a company, thinks it's in their interest to make a $15 floor on their salary and pay everyone at least that much or more, well, more power to them. Good for them. If they have the resources to do that, if they make that decision, that's their decision. It could be right, it could be wrong, but they live with the consequences of that decision, whether for better or for worse. There's probably going to be people who support them for that. Maybe they'll get more business from people who, want to spend their money to a virtuous company. This is kind of like a virtue signaling move, in my view. But it's more power to them. Where they go wrong is in a recent statement when they announced this, they've also said that they're going to add more money to their campaign to lobby for a $15 minimum wage at the federal level. So in other words, they're going to do it themselves voluntarily for their company, but then they're going to spend money and effort to actually get the government to mandate that everybody do this. And this is just crossing the threshold, and it gets back into this idea of why minimum wage is such a bad idea to begin with. So I think to understand my view on this, you have to understand why minimum wage is a bad thing. So let's talk about that a little bit. Minimum wage says that nobody can work for any job in this country unless the salary is at least $15 or higher. If somebody is paid less than $15, it is an illegal job, and that person can be held liable for paying the person too little. So what's wrong with that? Some people would say it prevents exploitation from big companies who can afford to pay more and don't. Others will say, well, what about people who can't afford a living wage? They've got families, they've got homes and cars and kids, they need to feed their families. What if they can't do it on a $10 wage? And 15 isn't even that much, but maybe it's enough to get them through the threshold. Maybe they will be off the poverty line, they won't have to go and get welfare if we mandate a $15 minimum wage. Well, the problem with a $15 minimum wage is that it's essentially an anti-reality viewpoint. You cannot legislate productivity. Remember before I said you can't use force to change somebody's mind, right? A mind can only be changed by evidence, facts, argument, reason. You can only give them better ideas to change their mind. In the same way, you cannot point a gun at a firm and say, pay this person $15 an hour and make it work economically. If a person's labor is worth less than $15 an hour, then employing that person for $15 or more loses you money as the employer. And it would be irrational for you to do it. You will not stay solvent as a company if you employ people whose labor is worth less than the salary you give them. So what does this mean? It means unemployment. Ultimately, it means anyone whose labor is worth less than $15 an hour can't get a job, or at least can't get a legal job. They're driven underground. They have to work in places that are not under scrutiny of the public. They're basically committing a felony by doing this. So what's the answer here? Why are you basically making it harder for them to get a job when they would have happily worked for $10 an hour or $12 an hour or even $8 an hour? All of that is more than $0 an hour, which is what they're working at now. So the employers aren't going to hire you unless you're $15 or your labor is worth $15 or more. Now, on top of that, this also makes it so that people who have less skills who are starting out, so for example, teenagers, people who are young, people in poor communities, this is a huge problem ultimately for the poor black community, because a lot of them, their labor isn't really worth $15 or more. It may be worth less. Think about it. If you're in high school and it's your first job, you basically are going to take anything as long as you can get your foot in the door, as long as you can have some money to pay for gas for your car, go to see your friends, the bowling alley, buy a soda every now and again. That was me when I was in high school. I worked as a cashier at a drugstore. I was making just over $8 an hour when I was in high school. It wasn't much, but it was something, and I learned a lot on the job. I learned how to come into work on time. I learned how to deal with customers. I learned how to stock supplies. Heck, I even worked the 24-hour photo booth. Those things where you'd bring in a roll of film, and then they would basically develop your film in 24 hours or less, and then you could pick it up. I worked that. I learned how to change the reels. I learned how to crop and edit. I learned how to do all these things with the computer. That technology has now largely been superseded by smartphones. Everyone has a camera on their phone. But at the time, it was actually a really good gig. It was after school, 4 to 10, 4 to 9, depending on, the day of the week. And, it was enough for me to, have some spending money, be a little bit more financially independent from my parents. If I wanted to buy lunch and have a fancier meal with friends, if I wanted to buy a cookie instead of, just getting whatever lunch they had, or if after school I wanted to go to the bowling alley or the movie theater, I wouldn't have to ask and beg my parents for money. I was independent. And I think, in a way, those early jobs really do set the tone for people later in life. And to think about it, if you don't go to college, being a manager at a McDonald's or a gas station or a store, a drugstore, that's a pretty good gig for someone who doesn't have a college degree. They can make some decent money. They don't have the debt that someone who's coming out of college has. And, there are people who even start their own franchises, their own businesses down the road because they have all this experience. They know how to manage money. They know how to manage customers. They know how to manage a large staff. These are all positive things. And when you make a minimum wage of $15 or more, what you're doing is you're denying anyone who has a worth less than that those opportunities. And why? It's allegedly to avoid exploitation. Well, I got to tell you something. This is a really, really well-kept secret. Don't tell anyone, but there's no such thing as exploitation in the free market. It doesn't exist. Exploitation is a Marxist myth. In a free economy, where people are trading with one another voluntarily, if the government outlaws force, if it outlaws fraud, if it outlaws me going to you and kidnapping you in the middle of the night and strapping you to a coal mine with some chains and then forcing you to work, that's not an exploitive job. That's called slavery. That's called kidnapping. There are laws against that in a capitalist society. If you don't want to work for me, you're free to go. You're free to go and work somewhere else. And employers compete with one another, not just for customers, but for employees. That's proper. I work right now as a software engineer. I worked at a few companies. And whenever I was between jobs, it wasn't like I went with the first one that gave me an offer and I was exploited. It was a two-way trade. They wanted my labor. I wanted the paycheck. It was a mutual trade for a mutual gain. That's what happens in a capitalist enterprise or a free enterprise system. Exploitation doesn't occur. Now, I mentioned this briefly when I was doing my Nike video a few weeks ago with Colin Kaepernick and Nike and so-called sweatshops in the third world. By the way, this term sweatshop, I'm pretty much against the idea of a sweatshop because it's not really doing justice to what it really is, which is a facility in a third world country with no infrastructure, low skills, low education, for people to rise up and make something of themselves economically. There's nothing bad about that. There's nothing improper about that. If the choice is between working on a farm, starving, or working in a sweatshop, I would choose the sweatshop any day. And I think that's moral. I think it's proper. And I don't think that anyone in the first world who's sitting comfortably in a capitalist country or a basically capitalist country that has a great deal of wealth that was generated by the same sweatshop labor here in the West should be entitled to go to the third world and tell them that they should raise themselves from 0 to 100 overnight. It just doesn't happen. You have to build an infrastructure. You have to build skills. You have to plant roots before you can be a full-fledged oak. And that metaphor holds in this context as well with minimum wage. So Amazon, fine if you want to pay your workers $15 an hour, but don't go around and mandate that everyone do it. In fact, some people have pointed out that this is probably a political ploy by Amazon to bankrupt and force out their weaker competitors. Think about it. If you're Amazon, you're a juggernaut, you can maybe afford a $15 minimum wage for a time. I don't think even Amazon would be able to do it across the board. No, they're only doing it in the United States, and they're only doing it up to $15 an hour, which isn't that big of an increase, if you only consider U.S. workers. If you expand this to China, if you expand this to all the different employees they have all over the globe, that becomes expensive real quick. And so they probably are banking on the fact that there will be federal legislation eventually passed that makes it so all of them have a $15 wage. So they've gained some credibility with the left and a lot of these people who think that there is exploitation, and they've moved the needle on getting that legislation passed so that the weaker competitors they have, who don't have as much money as Amazon has, won't be able to afford it. They'll be hiring fewer workers, and they'll eventually go out of business. So they'll have to restrict their market share. They'll have to pull back from markets that have high labor costs. So I tend to view this as a cynical political move, but it's buttressed ultimately by bad economics and even worse philosophy. So that's all I have to say. Hi, Rob here. Did you like what you saw? If you're really interested and want to see more, click the link below and check out my YouTube channel to see full episodes of the One in the Many videocast. Thanks. Hope to see you later. Bye.